Welcome to the BPP Film Law Society Q&A with Johan Ewing and Luke Carey. I'm Charlie, the president of Film Law Society.
I'm Nicola, and I'm a content writer for the Society. So first of all, what we want to say is thank you for supporting the Film Law Society. We're a student-run society at BPP, and we're curating a series of talks with legal professionals that specialise in entertainment law. So you can follow our Instagram and our LinkedIn pages just to find out a little bit more about future events and opportunities.
So just a short introduction for our guest today. Johan Ewing is a legal director at Lee Thompson in the firm's film and television group. He assists on matters relating to the development, production, financing, and distribution of film and TV production. Prior to joining L&T, he trained at Wigan before working in-house at NBC Universal for 3 years, and then for European Film Bonds for 4 years. Luke Carey is a senior associate within the film and TV group at Lee Thompson, also advising on the development, production, financing, and distribution of film projects. Before joining L&T, Luke spent a decade working in production before working as a paralegal and training at Freshfields. We're honoured to have Johan and Luke talk with us today, so thank you very much for joining us. My first question for you both is, when did you know you wanted to become lawyers, and what led you to specialise in the area of film and TV?
Go first, Johan.
Yeah, I realise I've got an incredibly specific answer for this. So saying certain things that you kind of probably, everyone tells you not to when you go to university, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, but I knew I wanted to go. And I was very good at maths, so I decided to do a degree in accounting and management, which really requires very little skill in maths whatsoever. I was a little bit out of place. But the first year had a Foundations of Business Law course, and it was the unit that I enjoyed the most by a long way. So I did all my electives in law and then did a law conversion. And that was really like when I got under the skin of it and got a real interest in law, which, yeah, I hadn't really considered too much before I went to university. And then in terms of media law, or kind of fairly more specifically film and TV, that came fairly naturally. It was a lot of strong interest and involvement in content making and music as well as film and TV, and silly things like my first job when I was 16 was because I was in a cinema not because I loved getting popcorn grease all over me for 12 hours a day, but it was through like a love of kind of films and filmmaking. And when I came to look at training contracts, I was really looking at departments with strong media teams, or kind of media firms, primarily looking at film, TV, broadcast, and music back then. And I think looking back now, I can really tell I was applying for like big corporate firms who happened to have a tiny media practice that was maybe 1% of their turnover. And I kind of realized I must have stuck out a little bit. I remember distinctly having an interview at DLA, and I had to do a presentation, and it was on high-end TV production and why it was growing and going to be big business. And obviously now that looks extremely prescient. Back then in a corporate law firm setting, I think a few people were looking at me thinking like, TV? What's this guy going on about? So yeah, that was really, it's kind of, I also looked at a kind of couple of other areas that I was interested in, but that was very much the leading one for me.
Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, so that was a really clear path for you from the beginning, even though you weren't quite sure specifically what it was going to be. But Luke, for you kind of came from a different angle, right? You came from working in film and production, and now you've come into being a lawyer.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine I can imagine that there was I've come from the same background as you, so I can imagine there might have been some times when you're like on splits or you're doing a night shift and it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're thinking there must be something else. But what kind of specifically made you realise that actually I want to go into the legal side of the film and TV industry?
Yeah, as you said, I sort of came at it from a very, like, almost the opposite angle to Johan. You said I sort of did the sort of production work, and that was all I ever wanted to do. When I was a kid and kind of going to university, that was always my aim. I didn't really have a plan for law at all. It was I wanted to work in film production. And it's sort of, for me, having done that, I did that for about 10 years. For me, it was, I think the turning point was a sort of not middle-aged, but sort of having a juncture in my life when I was around sort of coming up to 30, where I was having family and all that kind of stuff, and kind of properly trying to think about what it was I wanted to do with my life long term. Having enjoyed working in film, I thoroughly enjoyed working in film and TV, and I worked for I was working for one particular production company for a very long time, and I was leaving there and trying to sort of work out what it was I wanted to do next. And I'd gone sort of freelance, I'd done freelance production work, and was working, as you said, on doing these productions where you're working long days and nights and whatever else, and trying to look at it at that point and say, well, what's my role within the film and TV industry? What is it I want to do? Do I want to produce, or do I want a more sort of, a production role of some sort? Do I want to be production manager, line producer, or whatever that might be? And I kept looking at these roles and thinking, it's not quite what I want. What is it that I do want? And the advantage I'd had working for this particular production company, it was quite a small production company, so I got to be really involved with everything. You get a real sense, particularly what producers do, but a lot of what that then entailed was getting very familiar with the kind of contracts and business affairs side of being a producer. And so I realized that was the sort of area I wanted to kind of look at in more detail and maybe sort of look for opportunity in. And so I started going for kind of interviews still within the industry on the basis of looking to do like business affairs or some sort in-house, and was getting interviews and kind of getting somewhere, but based on the sort of practical experience I had working in the industry. But the feedback I always got for not getting those jobs was that they wanted someone with some sort of legal background or to sort of accompany that, which then, and from there it just sort of escalated really, because I then said, well, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Again, because I hadn't really sort of considered it from the sort of being a lawyer sort of perspective before, and not necessarily that I would need to kind of get fully qualified in order to do those roles, but what would the first step look like? And so on the back of that, I did my GDL sort of conversion course. Having done English at university, I did the GDL to have some sort of legal qualification. And I think by the time I'd finished the GDL, I sort of realised that I think I sort of had an aptitude for doing it, and I really enjoyed it, and that was actually something I could sort of take all the way basically at that point and go, well, actually, having done the GDL, sort of say, well, actually, if I just sort of keep that going, I can sort of get fully qualified and then find a way of marrying the two, and because the aim was always to still do it within film and TV. But it was whether or not I could do that. I think at first I wondered whether I could do that just by having a sort of a bit of a qualification, and that would let me do stuff in-house. Might well have done, but on the back of that, I then kind of got my training contract and all that kind of stuff. It sort of went off from there, really. I think the catalyst was definitely that sort of moment of just having done it for 10 years, just trying to work out what I wanted to do within the industry. It was very industry specific, and then finding my best role for it within that, really, which is where the law sort of came in.
And do you find now that experience that you had, particularly when you were working in that very small production company, where you are getting a little bit of a look into everything, do you think that has kind of shaped your approach to the way that you look at legal issues and when you're advising clients and you're negotiating deals? Or do you try and kind of separate the two things and look at the law for what it is without really considering the fact you've been on the other side?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Partly, I think, from the point of view now that, because again, once you kind of get into film and TV law, there's lots of different areas within that. So I, sort of said in the introduction, work across development, production, finance, whatever else. For me specifically, I do it very much from a representing producers' point of view. Most of my clients are producers, the kind that I used to work, with.
Right.
And that I think has largely been because of my background, that kind of automatically gravitated towards those sorts of clients and that sort of work anyway. But as a result of which, and part of the reason, I think I enjoy it and hopefully I'm very good at it is it does help understanding what they're doing. And I think being, whether it's kind of small things when you're, negotiating kind of certain contracts, whether it's like something like negotiating a cast contract or a talent contract of some sort, they're asking for particular, things that they, want to be able to, have or do, when they're on location. And just, there's a part of me that just automatically kind of practically thinks about that's even realistic for a producer. Whereas I think if you don't necessarily, I think those sort of things sometimes people can ask for without really understanding the practical difficulties or even possibilities, whether it's even possible. They want X sort of trailer or whatever it might be on location, and actually talking to the producers and saying, well, look, I know that actually you might not be able to offer that, can you? And just sort of thinking about it more sensibly, I think it's quite useful.
And the nuance as well, I guess, of the of some of those temperaments that come with the industry.
I think just generally, for me, fortunately, I think anyone working in this industry and even in law, you get a good sense of feel for the industry, and then I think the vast majority of people doing it, whether it's the people like my clients, that are doing it because they want to produce films, or whether it's people like us kind of supporting that from the legal side or whatever it might be. I think generally everyone tends to be a big fan of the industry one way or the other.
Right.
For it. So I think we all tend to be pulling in the same direction in that sense. But
so just talking about past experiences, Johan, we mentioned in the intro that before joining L&T, you were head of legal and business affairs at European Film Bonds, which is a completion guarantor. I just wondered.
Sorry, was a completion guarantor.
Was a on that note, for those attending, could you briefly explain what a completion guarantee is and why they're important for financiers in the film industry?
Yeah, of course. I like to use a bit of an example when I kind of describe it to people, and I appreciate people might be a bit more savvy with the industry than some of the people I have explained it to in the past, so apologies if it's a bit simple. But Charlie, you've just met Luke. Imagine you're a wealthy financier looking to put money into a film or TV project, and Luke's just imagine he's a super cool producer with loads of charisma. Just imagine it. And he's got this great project, this exciting screenplay with people attached, but you don't really know him. And on top of that, film and TV is notoriously high risk. There's a lot of moving parts that all have to come together very quickly, and when things start going wrong, they can snowball and cost a lot to fix. And there's also the odd film that has collapsed for whatever reason partway into production. What a completion guarantor effectively does is, if the financier puts up the requisite funds, then they will guarantee that the film or TV show is completed and delivered to a sales agent or distributors. So if they fail to do that, they're potentially on the hook to repay the financiers all of the money they've put in. They have very strong, wide-ranging powers over production to take over production, fire people in order to complete it if needs be. And they can be on the hook for overages if a project does go wrong in order to complete and deliver it.
What was as the sort of lawyer in that process, what was your role at a high level?
So I think fundamentally, you're kind of negotiating the paperwork around production and financial close, which all tends to happen. It starts a few weeks out from production and tends to lock in pretty close prior to production. And that is making sure that everyone involved in the project, from financiers to cast to directors and even distributors, if they're signed up at that stage, is on the same page to release funding, and also there's a clear production plan in place. It can also stretch to getting involved in production when things go wrong, or when things are going not quite wrong but awry, and someone needs to come in with a bit of a firm hand to direct things. And I think one of the terrific things for me is that I was 2 or 3 years qualified at that stage, and I was negotiating across from partners and decision makers across the industry in that role, and that was terrific, and you learn a lot very quickly. And I think the other thing is you kind of a lot of people in legal and business affairs in film and TV can tend to specialize in a particular area. So if you're in-house, you're very specialized, and in private practice, you can tend to lean towards production or financing, typically. And one of the good things about the role is that you're relatively across the whole project. From you're very involved in the financing, you're involved in production, and you're also involved in delivery and potentially distribution elements as well.
On that note, what was it? Was there a sort of driving factor that led you to move from sort of working in-house to private practice?
Well, I started in private practice as well, and there were a number of different reasons. The principal driver is kind of working a bit more broadly with clients and working with and for different clients, because you're working for your own company from your own perspective, and although you're quite wide across the transaction, you're looking at it just from the completion guarantor's perspective. Shifting seats and moving into the different seats, looking at it from a producer's perspective, financiers, even a sales agent or a public funder, all of which we've acted for. It's a much kind of broader, fuller, deeper experience of the industry, and you get a far greater understanding and kind of influence across the industry, I'd say.
Wow.
Sorry, was that a bit succinct?
No, it was great, and I was thinking, that sounds great. I would do that. You really sold it.
Just switch everybody off of in-house jobs.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And now I guess you're at a much more specialist place, but kind of doing things a bit broader. But Luke, you started at Freshfields, right? In their tiny, like, little margin of media. Do they have any media?
It wasn't media. So when I was there, they have an IP department.
Right. Okay.
It's not, but the IP department isn't particularly kind of media. Like, there are bits of media stuff within it, but it's not film and TV in any sort of way, really.
Right. Okay. Because I've dealt with them a tiny little bit in the past for IP. So you were there in all their kind of corporate glory.
Yeah. So I was going to say, I didn't do IP. I trained there and then qualified into full corporate. M&A,
right.
Corporate M&A.
Right. And now you've moved to Lee Thompson. So you've had experience of doing both. How have the kind of two different environments between that kind of large, big structure and this kind of boutique specialist kind of lovely company, have they differed in terms of like the work and the clients and the culture and just, I guess, access to your clients and your...
I mean, as you can imagine, they're vastly different.
Right.
I guess the thing for me was I went into Freshfields, as I said, my move into law was on the basis that I did want to do film and TV law. And I would probably add that, you know, when I was looking to make that sort of transition, I was very fortunate from my kind of background. I knew a lot of people, you know, in the film. You know, I knew Lee Thompson. I knew, you know, other kind of similar firms from having worked with them when I was working production. And I remember kind of talking to them and trying to work out how I could move straight into somewhere like here. You know, and you know, the unfortunate thing to an extent with that is that, you know, as you said, it is smaller. The opportunities are smaller and more limited because of the size and the type of work, and, you know, trying to join as something like a trainee or whatever, I think is quite difficult because it is limited. And so for me, it was finding a way to essentially, you know, what was a way of getting qualified. And, you know, for various reasons, you know, I got the opportunity at Freshfields, took it on the basis that I wanted to get qualified, and that was where the opportunity, you know, a very good opportunity for me was. But I think, in a way, for me, going in there, knowing that ultimately my end game was probably still coming somewhere like this, helped to some extent, because it is tough. You know, it's a massive firm full of 2,000 lawyers, and, you know, we're less than 100 lawyers, sort of thing. So it is vastly different in that sense. Just the kind of scale and expectation is very different. You know, here you do get, you know, from day one, sort of, you know, whatever level you're at, you get much more, you know, client engagement and kind of engagement with, you know, people across the firm. My experience as someone like Freshfields, you know, it's very different because, you know, I was in an intake of, I think it was like for the year, I think it was like 90 trainees.
Right.
And you're sort of, you know, you're one of the many sort of faceless small people that, you know, there to do a certain job. But, you know, in return, you know, that's not to say that I think the quality of the work is different.
Mm-hmm.
The scale of the work is also very different, the part you play in it. But, I mean, and again, I'm not, you know, that's the only place I've trained, and I would say it was very good training to be a lawyer. It definitely definitely has that going for it. And actually, you know, when I went in, although, like I said, you know, with this sort of place in mind as my end game, I went in still very kind of open mind, you know, as to what the opportunity might bring, you know, like, in terms of where I ended up qualifying or what I ended up doing and the opportunities that it presented. Like, I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. I think I really rated as a firm, and I think, you know, it was a good place to be in. And I got a lot of good quality, you know, work, but it's just, like I said, the scale of it is just very different because, you know, I was working, particularly, you know, when I qualified into sort of corporate M&A, you know, it's very different sort of way of working, I guess, where you're on a massive team of lots of lawyers all working something together, whatever part you may play on. You know, but the size and scale of it kind of warrants that. Whereas now, you know, I can be doing transactions by myself or transactions where there's any kind of one or maybe two other people who are sort of working together as a much smaller team. But the scale of it is sort of small to start with. So, you know, it's just sort of very different in that sense, I guess. I think that's much more enjoyable now.
Right. I think that's just really useful for people to know generally, you know, that there are, if you've got a specific field of law that you feel like that's where you might want to be, you know, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? To get into it. You can get into it the way that you did, whilst benefiting from all of those amazing opportunities, but knowing that you can sidestep. You're not just stuck on that trajectory just because that's where you're doing a training contract.
I think that's right. And again, you know, I think everyone here would be kind of testament to that. Like, I think most of the people here come from different routes and paths and ways of getting to the firm. You know, whether it's people who, who joined the firm as sort of paralegals, having done the vacation scheme and then sort of training all the way through, or a lot of the kind of lateral hires who have come from, you know, city firms like I did, or have kind of come from in-house kind of opportunities. Like, it's a real kind of range of different backgrounds that people have got when they come to kind of firms like this.
So I think we just have just have one more question before we open up the floor for the Q&A. One recurring theme in the submitted questions before the event, sort of on the day-to-day work of film and TV and media lawyers. Could you both share an example of perhaps a recent project or a deal that you both that you worked on at LMT and describe the specific roles you played in that process?
Shall I go first, Luke?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think it's worth understanding that the work briefly, very, very broadly, breaks out into two general categories. The first is kind of development, which is acquiring rights. So the classic is an option agreement over a book to then commission a writer, perhaps with a development agreement with a financier. You try to then develop the project to the point at which it's packaged and you can set it up for production. And that is there's a lot of work involved in that that's generally less time sensitive, but it's quite important as it underpins entire productions. You've also got, there's quite a bit of it because obviously not everything that's developed goes into production. And I hear very different figures for how much it is. The other section is kind of your production, tends to be called like legal close or financial close. And that is the kind of typically 4 to 8 week process where you're contracting everything with financiers, cast, director, producers, etc., to release funding to go into production on the film or TV show. There's then ongoing production work, and there's kind of precedent work for clients perhaps, and kind of bespoke queries kind of all the time. But it broadly breaks into those two sectors. This kind of very intense, quite kind of narrow period of time where you're kind of closing these projects and the kind of development stage. And then when you're working in the industry, if you're working for producers, you tend to be working across all of that. If you're working for financiers, you tend to be much more focused on the legal close element because you're not so involved, if at all, in the development stages. So, and I think the question was it a recent project, or like, I can just tell you what I was doing today if you like.
I suppose, yeah, whatever you think is most illustrative of the sort of day-to-day work that you do.
There's a lot of variety. And bear in mind, because I act for financiers and producers, so I can be putting on quite different hats. But today I've been doing a very detailed access and services agreements for a company that's involved in access documentary. And that's very detailed. At the tail end of last week, I was doing a financial close for a producer where I was negotiating loan documents, various multi-party documents between distributor, financier, producer, negotiating cast contracts, director agreement, producer agreements, all to get in place in time to release funding and go into production.
Right, and Luke, would you say yours is similarly very varied?
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't tend to work on the financing side at all. I tend to, majority of all my clients are kind of on the producer production side. But again, kind of similar. If I just think about the last day or so in terms of the work I've been doing. So I've got one of those sort of transactions that is literally in the midst of closing at the moment. So it's kind of, when you get to that kind of end period, it tends to be quite full on. So like my last day or so has been spent trying to deal with three lead cast who some of whom are already on location and are starting to shoot and kind of getting their agreements finalized. We've got another one who's traveling at the end of this week, so trying to get their agreement in place and kind of agreements for the funding of their money in advance in place, partly for the cast themselves to make sure they'll get on the plane and come and do their role, partly because we need those agreements in place as one of the conditions for closing that finance, which means at the same time we've also been doing those finance agreements that Johan was talking about and trying to make sure that they're all, we're in the sort of nitty gritty of the last bits, trying to get down to those last final points so that essentially everyone, all the different financiers, because this is a film that's got I think about 6 or 7 different financiers on it, so making sure all their agreements are finalised with the final numbers of what exactly is their funding and when they're funding, and they're kind of satisfied that all the conditions have been met for them to release their funding when we close. Combined with the fact that we're also shooting overseas, and there are certain kind of particular conditions around that we're having to kind of line up and meet as well. Quite a lot of lots of little bits kind of constantly kind of churning in order to get all those things in place. That's not to say I'm doing it all by myself. There is a team of 3 of us working on it. But it's essentially to close these transactions. We can. I think we've got nearly. I think it's like 60 different documents or something that we've got to make sure are all either signed or ready to be signed at some point this week. So it's just quite kind of busy trying to manage all that and constantly talking to people to make sure they're all in the right place.
Right. So I've got a question from Paula in the chat. Do you have any legal insights or advice to someone who's opening their own production company?
I mean,
you look like you're about to answer that.
Best of luck to you. It's a difficult thing to do, and I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different production companies focusing on different types of content, and I think just I think a lot of it applies to any kind of young business, but just and it all comes down to money. I think it's like there's a lot on the relationship side, but making sure you've got the kind of financing in place to take you far enough to start generating revenue, making sure that the kind of deals you're negotiating are work from a commercial perspective, and also being aware of the financing models and how they vary. If you set up a project at a streamer, you're not going to have the long tail of rights and potential revenues as if you set up a TV show at a terrestrial broadcaster and sell it internationally. And they're very different business models. And just keep at it. It's tough. I mean, Luke, you probably know better. You probably know much more about it than me.
I'm the best person to ask, because I'm the person that thought about being a producer and then decided it was better to be a lawyer instead. So yeah, I definitely know how tough it is. Equally, I know how I think rewarding it is for those that do stick with it and are able to make a go of it, because it, as Johan said, it is absolutely tough. But I think you just kind of have to definitely have persevere and have something. You have to be the right sort of person to kind of stick with that and put yourself through that and go for it. So pretty fair place.
I have another question from Tolu, and this is for Johan. What would you say is the biggest difference between working in-house and working at a firm?
I mean, fairly specifically around film and TV. In-house, you're kind of involved end to end on projects, but from a very specific perspective. So if you work for a producer, you're working on a project throughout the life cycle of a project. You're very involved with it. You're across it for a long time. But you may not work on too many other projects. Whereas if you're working, for a firm, obviously we're kind of, there's a cost element of where we're best suited to get involved, and you tend to get deeply involved in more projects for a shorter period of time. So you get a much wider kind of overview of the industry, working in a firm and industry trends and things like that. You can be a little bit kind of narrow in-house because you're always looking at everything from your own same perspective, being the company. But you're across those projects for like the life cycle, and you really get to know them inside out.
This is from Christos. How has the rise of streaming services and digital distribution platforms affected your work as film lawyers? For example, has it affected securing funding, licensing, cross-licensing? Do you think there are major differences between traditional film distribution versus streaming services distribution from a contract negotiation perspective?
Yes and yes. I think I'll just kind of jump in a little bit on it. I think like a lot of the sort of like the kind of streamer stuff, and certainly the stuff that kind of comes across my plate so far, in a way, part of it I think is the scale. A lot of the stuff I've done, so a lot of the bigger budget stuff I've worked on is kind of streamer based. I think from a kind of contracting point of view, it's in one sense simpler sometimes, because like a lot of the kind of independent stuff we work on, like the stuff I was referring to earlier, we're trying to do this closing where we're trying to corral 6-7 different financiers, all with kind of similar but sometimes competing kind of demands, and trying to kind of mold all that together. It's perhaps harder than where you can say, well, yeah, but I've got one streamer contract that I need to deal with. The flip side of that sometimes is that they can have even more leverage and control in terms of what it is they want to kind of put in place. And depending on who the client is, again, particularly for someone who works for producers, whether it's a producer that's got something about them where we can kind of do a negotiation, or whether it's someone where there isn't much of a negotiation to be had, unfortunately. So I think there's kind of differences in that respect, but equally, it can also work to your benefit sometimes. Again, particularly from a producer's perspective, I think there are films I've done where, because we've had Netflix or Apple or whoever it is involved, when you're trying to then negotiate other contracts, whether it's with cast or whatever it might be, there's a certain amount of leverage as producers you get by saying, well, actually, we can't do that because streamer says we can't do that, or it doesn't fit with their kind of policies. There are definitely kind of different considerations in that sense, some which are good and some which maybe aren't so good. And
got a question from Kira. Where would you recommend to start with no experience in the entertainment industry? I would assume in-house would be better to start, but from looking, I've noticed that they do also want experience. And actually on that note, Luke, specifically, would you say that the route that you took working for a large commercial firm is one that you would advise others to do if they're struggling to get into smaller media law firms?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think for me as someone who kind of already had the kind of film and TV background and was looking to kind of break into particular kind of film and TV law, and like I said, for someone and I knew Lee and Thompson, and I knew kind of similar firms and lawyers already doing this. And before I went and kind of embarked on that journey, I sat down with them all and was like, well, how do I get a job with you, basically, if that's what I want, that sort of thing. And I think some of the best advice I got, it wasn't from Lee and Thompson, but some of the best advice I got, certainly for me as it panned out, was that ultimately the key thing is to get qualified. Like that in a way is the most, from a personal point of view, was the most important thing was just getting qualified and getting that training contract wherever that was. And as I said earlier, opportunities for that specifically within this industry are kind of limited and are hard, but I think there are plenty of opportunities for the right people to kind of move across. So in a way, I think not, again, sort of certainly borne out by my experience, is not narrowing kind of mindset in terms of what it is you're applying for is a good idea. I mean, that said, most of the places that I was applying for either for vacation schemes or experience or training contracts, were places that did have at least some sort of media kind of team in some form, even if it wasn't doing film and TV. It was, something that had IP or had media or whatever. It wasn't some sort of way or shape or form, with a view that at least that would give me maybe something to kind of try out. And as I said, actually, as it turned out in the end, I ended up at Freshfields, and yes, they did have an IP department. And actually that was, to be fair, that was my favorite. That was my favorite seat that I did in my training contract. But on qualification, that again was very kind of limited in that regard, which is why I ended up in corporate. But I think, I certainly wouldn't rule it out. I think ultimately depends on who you are and what you like and what's kind of driving. I guess it's kind of what's driving you and what specifically you want to do. Like I said, even for someone like me that was very keen on, I just wanted, when I changed to law, it's because I wanted to do film and TV law, and given my background, that's what it was going to be. Even I tried to keep a bit of a sort of an open mind, because ultimately once you're qualified, it's potentially easier to then kind of make that transition. But again, it just depends on where the opportunities arise. Like I said earlier, that here, for example, with the kind of route that we have for kind of new people coming through, it tends to be as paralegals with a view to a training contract. Like I said, but all those people have got experience in some form or another already, having done having done the sort of academic side of things usually, and but I think it's about, for people wanting to get into this industry, it's still about showing your enthusiasm for it. Certainly somewhere like this, and that can be demonstrated in all sorts of ways. Whether that's having had an in-house opportunity or just otherwise sort of being able to demonstrate in some way that this is what you're interested in.
I think I think that's all right, and I think I'd just jump in and like to add on what Luke's saying. I think like show your passion to the area, and that like, I wouldn't want to pin down how someone does that, because every time I think we've kind of seen everything, you see something new and some like new unique experience that someone has that turns out it's like, yeah, you're really interested in this area. It's kind of really clear. And I'll never forget looking at applications a few years ago and someone saying, oh, I've got a big DVD collection. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like saying you like films. Like, almost everyone likes films. That, show why you're passionate about this area, why you kind of want to work in this area, not just like a kind of excuse for it. And then that's kind of the film and TV kind of, and media and entertainment more widely specific bit, alongside the kind of like qualifications and experience side. And VAC schemes are great. I think Luke, I think our VAC scheme closed last week, applications, but we have but we have a VAC scheme running every year. Other firms do as well, and like all of those kind of entry points to just go, both work experience style and nothing to do with work, just like personal passions. Being on the BPP Film and TV Society. Sorry, I'm forgetting the full title, but that of itself and kind of involvement in that is indicative. I wouldn't want to pin it down or kind of give too many examples, because it's always different.
Yeah. And again, as I said, there are also, there are, if it is specifically this industry, there are usually kind of other industry kind of events or things you can kind of sign up for and get used to, just kind of showing that broader interest in the industry and learning about the industry, whatever it might be, is usually a good way of going. I think if you can come in, because if you do get the opportunity to kind of come in and then, like I said, understand it in some form, or be able to demonstrate that enthusiasm in some form, that's usually helpful.
I've got a question about ChatGPT. ChatGPT technology is getting smarter and faster. In terms of traditional lawyering, how do you see this AI technology affect IP chain protection and verification? And I suppose, do you see it as a sort of potentially opening the floodgates to a radical shift in the legal profession more generally?
I wouldn't rule it out, but at the moment, I think the technology is quite a long way off. I think you can get creative writing with it, but I think last weekend I just experimented with getting it to do a couple of clauses, and there were fundamental misunderstandings. I was with someone who's not a lawyer, who works in insurance, who looked at it and thought, oh, that's pretty good. And I looked at it and thought, that's not usable. It's kind of picked up some of the terminology and concepts around what you're talking about, but it's fundamentally quite a way off. Now, if you give it access to all of the kind of confidential documents on deals, could it do better? I don't know, but I think there's a lot of nuance and soft areas, and one of the most interesting things about our job is how every deal and every agreement is different, even if you've done a lot of them before. And I'm not sure, certainly at the moment, I don't think AI or ChatGPT specifically is getting close to being able to imitate that kind of skill level. But that's just in my experience.
I have a career-related question. What's one thing you wish you knew earlier in your career that could have saved you time or made your journey easier? This applies to both of you.
I think one of the things for me was like applying for training contracts. And like I say, I think in hindsight, I spent a lot of time and energy applying for firms that weren't necessarily a good fit for me. And I think that kind of came through. And then when I was at the media and entertainment firms doing those applications, I think it was clear that it was a better fit. Not to say that I wouldn't rule those out, and part of it's probably my application style, but being aware of where you want to go, prioritizing, planning out your career a bit more, because those applications are so time intensive and so bespoke that you want to kind of really value your time and make sure the time you're putting in is kind of working towards a goal.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I remember doing the same thing and sort of having having taken on board the idea that it was just important to get qualified, having quite a kind of scattergun approach to what that might mean. I think once you can start being a bit more bespoke about these things, it definitely kind of comes through. I guess the sort of slight flip side to that, as I mentioned earlier, is definitely doing those applications in the right way and trying to be a bit focused, but equally, at the right point, I guess, not being too kind of specialized in who it is you're applying for. This kind of, I guess the point is there's quite a fine balance, I think, between sort of keeping an open mind and not just applying to everybody for that sort of thing. But also, I don't think it's necessarily about this isn't necessarily something to do with sort of being able to make the right decision sooner. But I think the other thing as well is about from my experience, looking at the kind of opportunities they come and thinking about your career as you go along. As someone who worked doing one thing for sort of 10 years or so, and then decided to kind of change tack. I mean, that's quite a kind of extreme example, but I think there are always things for everybody within their careers where you can kind of look at what you're doing or what it is you want, and kind of make positive sort of changes for yourself to kind of pursue something different or make a change in terms of what you're doing, and not being afraid to kind of make those changes sooner rather than later, I guess, to work out what it is you want. So it's usually a good idea.
And Luke, just touching on that transition that you made from production into the legal side, of a question from Paula. What is it about production that you didn't like? What made you switch from production to law?
It was a combination of things. It was partly sort of job security and regular paycheck. It was definitely that side of things, because I loved working in production, but for me, particularly at a point where I thought I might want to be a producer, and having kind of worked with very good producers and seeing at times what a struggle that was, both financially and emotionally and whatever else, and sort of looking at it and going, yes, I could do that, but do I really want to? Is that what I want to do? And as I said, it sort of coincided with a period in my life where I was family and all this kind of thing. I was like, actually, I kind of want something more stable in my life, and therefore looked at kind of what within the industry would maybe allow me to do that. And again, for me, that was not that was not continuing to go and work on productions and working ridiculous hours. That's not to say I still don't work ridiculous hours at some point, but at least I have slightly more control over it, and I'm not having to drive halfway around London, if not across the country, to do it. And again, not wanting to be in that position where you're looking at the next job and going, okay, when the next job comes along, I need to take this job because I need to make sure that I'm not missing out. I don't want to be left not working for 3 months or something. So it's sort of a combination of all those factors, like I said, combined with what I enjoyed and what I thought would be quite good at. That was sort of why I stepped away from it. But like I said, it was always with a view really that I was still going to be in and around the industry doing it this way instead, which means I get the best of both worlds now, which is quite nice.
And for both of you, in your experience, have you seen anyone from the legal side of things transition into being a producer sort of full time?
I mean, I'd be interested in Luke's thought on this, but I think they're quite different. Well, there's a lot of differences in skill set. I think what you do see increasingly is people like lawyers working up through the industry, and then when they're at a kind of mid-senior level, moving to in-house, and a few years later shifting from that legal and business affairs to flat out commercial and stepping into a COO type role or a kind of more commercial role. So I think that's quite common. I can't think of, there's a few lawyers who've done production and then come into law. There's plenty of those that I can think of. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any who've gone full producer route post-law.
I've got a couple of clients, certainly one I can think of who...
Oh, there you go, shows what I know.
I think it's rare. I do think it's rare. It's definitely useful. I think it's definitely possible. But yeah, I've got at least one, maybe two clients who I know were previously lawyers and then for various reasons sort of stepped more into production roles and now engage us because it's better. So yeah, it does it does definitely happen. And as you said, there are lawyers who take on more of an EP role in the process of also doing the kind of legals as well, and then kind of get EP credits, whether that's because they're bringing about kind of relationships or taking on more of a kind of active role on the kind of the business and sort of commercial side of putting those transactions together, as well as just sort of dealing with the legal. So yeah, it does happen.
I think EP credits, particularly on independent films, are a whole separate subject on which you can speak about a lot.
Just have another question from Christos. Who are the main stakeholders you interact with when acting for a client, and how easy or difficult is it to find the right balance between the different wishes of each stakeholder? For example, balancing the interests of producers versus directors versus talent. He asked because films are often very collaborative endeavors and might be tough to balance out all the interests of the parties involved.
It can be very tough. Some are tougher than others. It depends on the personalities. It depends on how clear a commercial deal has been negotiated before you're brought in. I mean, who you're interacting with will be the representatives of the other parties, maybe the other parties themselves. And then depending on who your client is, it'll depend on their size, whether they've got their own legal capabilities in-house, or you're kind of interacting with a commercial person, or with smaller outfits, you'll be interacting with the kind of owner and kind of directing influence. And, especially I'd say acting for production, you're bringing together those disparate interests, and you're kind of caught in the middle, making sure that you're squaring circles and bringing everyone onto the same page. And the level of difficulty varies enormously in that.
Yeah. So the only thing I would add to that is, as you sort of hit upon in the question, like film and TV is collaborative. So even with all those kind of clients and other stakeholders, whatever, that are kind of coming together to do those deals, most of the time at least, it is also collaborative. You've got everyone's goals ultimate goal to some extent is the same in terms of making sure it's financed and can be made. That's for everyone's benefit. So in that sense, yeah, it's definitely still kind of collaborative, like Johan said, whether you're acting for the producer in the middle of all of that and trying to keep it all as get what you want and balanced versus whether you have specific kind of interests in being part of that deal. That's where the kind of difficulty can lie sometimes, and that's where the balance and the difficulty of the job can be. But
right, I think that's a interesting question to end on. I've realised the time, and I think that brings us to the end of today's Q&A session. So I just want to say a huge thank you to our guests, Johan and Luke, for taking the time to share your insights and your expertise with us. It's been incredibly informative and really engaging discussion. So thank you.
Very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. No, it was lovely to be involved, and yeah, best of luck to everyone, and let us know if you have other kind of questions or bits we can help out with, and yeah, if you're looking for experience as well, it's I think you can do worse than looking at the ARVAC scheme and others. Yeah. But thank you all. Have a lovely Monday early evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
See you, Luke.
Bye.
Bye.
See ya.